George Washington, reluctant power. It's hard to imagine the father of a nation hesitating to use power, but that's exactly what made George Washington both extraordinary and flawed. He'd seen what unchecked power could do. The revolution, the monarchy, the chaos of empire, all of it convinced him that absolute authority was poison. So when America made him its first president, Washington's greatest fear wasn't failure, it was becoming a tyrant. That fear shaped every decision he made. He refused to join political parties, stayed neutral in European wars, and stepped down after 2 terms, moves that defined democratic humility. But his restraint came with a cost. By avoiding partisanship, he left a growing divide between Jefferson and Hamilton to fester, and the nation's first political parties exploded right after he left office. Washington's silence, meant to preserve unity, actually deepened division. His farewell warning against factional spirit became prophecy, and within a decade, America was locked in bitter political combat. Still, that reluctance gave the world a new model of leadership. Power voluntarily limited. A man who could have been king walked away instead. So what's the lesson here? Even the purest intentions can create unintended chaos. Washington taught us that restraint is noble, but if you pull back too far, others rush in to fill the space. That's the paradox of leadership. Sometimes not acting can change history just as much as acting.
Thomas Jefferson, Idealism versus Reality. Thomas Jefferson dreamed bigger than almost anyone of his time, a philosopher, scientist, architect, and revolutionary. He imagined a nation built on liberty, equality, and reason. But ideals are easy to write, much harder to live by. Jefferson believed in limited government and strict constitutional rules, yet when the chance came to buy the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803, doubling America's size overnight, he broke his own principles to make it happen. There was nothing in the Constitution that allowed such a purchase, but Jefferson did it anyway. And that's the heart of his contradiction. He preached small government, but used massive executive power when it suited his vision. He wrote that all men are created equal, yet enslaved hundreds on his own plantation. His words inspired freedom movements worldwide, but his actions showed how fragile ideals can be when tested by reality. Still, the Louisiana Purchase became one of America's greatest achievements, securing land, resources, and a path to the Pacific. Jefferson's hypocrisy built an empire. In the end, Jefferson's weakness wasn't malice, it was belief without balance. He saw himself as a guardian of principle, but history remembers the cracks between his philosophy and his choices. The lesson? Ideals mean nothing if they collapse under pressure. True leadership isn't about perfection. It's about living the truth you preach, even when it's inconvenient.
Andrew Jackson, Temper and Vengeance. Andrew Jackson was a fighter long before he became president, a war hero, a duelist, a man who wore his scars like medals. He saw life as a battle to be won, and that same fire built his fame, but it also became his greatest flaw. Jackson's pride and temper ruled his presidency. He didn't trust elites, bankers, or even his own advisors, only his instincts. When he went to war with the Second Bank of the United States, it wasn't just policy, it was personal. Jackson saw the bank as corrupt, a tool of the wealthy against the common man. So, he destroyed it, vetoed its charter, pulled federal deposits, and crippled the financial elite. It made him a hero to the people, but it also destabilized the economy. His unchecked power reshaped the presidency, showing future leaders just how far executive will could reach. But the darkest side of Jackson's anger came with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, forcing tens of thousands of Native Americans from their homes. The trail of tears that followed killed thousands, staining his legacy forever. In his mind, Jackson was protecting America's destiny. In reality, his rage and vengeance blinded him to its cost. The lesson? Leadership driven by emotion can spark great victories, but it leaves deep wounds behind. Jackson proved that passion wins power, yet compassion decides how history remembers you.
James Buchanan, Paralysis by Indecision. James Buchanan took office at the edge of a storm. America was splitting over slavery, and he believed his calm, compromise-driven approach could hold it together. But sometimes silence is the loudest mistake a leader can make. Buchanan's weakness wasn't cruelty or ambition, it was fear of confrontation. He believed the Constitution tied his hands, that the federal government couldn't stop states from leaving the Union. So when South Carolina seceded in 1860, he did nothing. No firm warning, no decisive move, just hope that the crisis would somehow resolve itself. That hesitation became history's turning point. Within weeks, more Southern states followed. The Union unraveled, and by the time Abraham Lincoln took office, war was unavoidable. Buchanan's inaction didn't preserve peace, it let chaos grow unchecked. Historians often rank him among the worst presidents, not because of corruption or scandal, but because he failed to act when action mattered most. He watched the house burn, afraid to choose a side. Buchanan's story is a haunting reminder. In moments of national crisis, neutrality is not leadership, it's surrender. His quiet caution cost hundreds of thousands of lives in the war that followed. The lesson? Sometimes doing nothing is the most dangerous decision of all. History doesn't remember those who meant well, it remembers those who moved when the world needed motion.
Abraham Lincoln, self-sacrificing obsession. Abraham Lincoln carried the weight of a broken nation on his shoulders, and he never put it down. His strength was empathy. His weakness was that he felt everything too deeply. When the Union fractured, Lincoln's entire being focused on one mission: to hold it together no matter the cost. He barely slept, skipped meals, and read casualty lists late into the night. Friends described him as pale, hollow-eyed, a man haunted by both duty and doubt. He battled not just a war, but himself. Waves of depression, the loss of his son Willie, and constant political isolation. Even his own cabinet doubted him. But through exhaustion and grief, he stayed relentless. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation, expanded federal power, and refused to let the dream of a united America die. When victory finally came, Lincoln didn't celebrate. The war had taken everything: his peace, his health, his joy. Days later, he was assassinated. He preserved the Union, but the fight consumed the man. Lincoln's obsession gave birth to modern America, yet it destroyed the human behind the legend. The lesson? Greatness always demands a price. Lincoln proved that leadership isn't about glory, it's about carrying the burden no one else will, even when it breaks you.
Ulysses S. Grant, trust in the wrong people. Ulysses S. Grant was the hero who ended the Civil War, a soldier of honor, loyalty, and unshakable faith in his friends. But that same loyalty, the quality that made him great on the battlefield, became his downfall in politics. When Grant entered the presidency, he brought with him a soldier's trust, believing men would serve with the same integrity he did. But Washington wasn't a battlefield. It was a maze of ambition and greed. And Grant, honest to the core, didn't see the traps. Scandals erupted around him: the Credit Mobilier affair, the whiskey ring, and a web of bribery and fraud that infected his administration. Grant himself never stole a cent, but he defended the guilty out of loyalty. He believed their innocence long after the evidence proved otherwise. That blindness shattered his credibility. The same public that once worshipped him as a war hero began to question his judgment. By the end of his presidency, Grant's name was tied to corruption, not because he was corrupt, but because he refused to believe others could be. Yet in his later years, he redeemed himself, writing his memoirs while dying of cancer, determined to leave truth behind. Grant's story reminds us, good men can still fail when their hearts outweigh their caution. Leadership isn't just about trusting people, it's about knowing who deserves that trust.
Woodrow Wilson saw himself not just as a president, but as a moral crusader chosen to shape the world. His intellect and conviction were unmatched, but so was his certainty that he alone knew what was right. At home, Wilson's reforms transformed America. Income tax, the Federal Reserve, antitrust laws. Abroad, he dreamed bigger, a world safe for democracy. But that same moral zeal became his greatest weakness. After World War I, Wilson pushed for the League of Nations, believing it would end all wars. Yet, he refused to compromise, not with allies, not with Congress, not even with those who agreed with him on principle, but differed on details. His arrogance alienated everyone he needed most. The Senate rejected the treaty. America turned inward. And Wilson, broken by a stroke, watched his global vision collapse. Even his closest aides were shut out as his wife quietly ran the White House in his place. Wilson's belief that he was morally infallible turned inspiration into isolation. His ideas were prophetic, but his pride kept them from lasting in his lifetime. His story proves that even the noblest vision fails when conviction hardens into ego. Leadership demands not just righteousness, but humility.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, power addiction. Franklin D. Roosevelt redefined what it meant to lead. 4 terms, a nation rescued from the Great Depression, victory in World War II. His achievements are unmatched. But behind that confidence and charm was a flaw few dared to confront, a belief that his power was indispensable. FDR's greatest strength, his ability to command loyalty and shape destiny, became his greatest weakness. He centralized authority, surrounded himself with competing advisors, and sometimes blurred ethical lines to keep control. His attempt to pack the Supreme Court in 1937 exposed that flaw. When the court struck down parts of the New Deal, Roosevelt tried to expand it, adding justices loyal to him. The plan failed, and his reputation for democratic leadership took a hit. Even his allies began to fear his reach. Yet FDR's willpower pushed the U.S. through its darkest years. He built hope where none existed. But by clinging too tightly to power, he reminded America that even saviors must have limits. His story proves that no matter how visionary a leader is, unchecked power eventually casts a long shadow, even over greatness itself.
John F. Kennedy, image over discipline. John F. Kennedy inspired a generation with his charm, eloquence, and vision. He embodied youth, progress, and confidence, a symbol of American idealism in the Cold War. But beneath that flawless image lay his greatest weakness, the triumph of appearance over preparation. Kennedy built his presidency on charisma and perception, yet early in office that lack of depth showed. The Bay of Pigs invasion, a disastrous attempt to overthrow Castro, exposed his inexperience and over-reliance on elite advisors. It humiliated America and nearly shattered his credibility. To his credit, JFK learned fast. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he showed restraint and brilliance that may have prevented nuclear war. But behind the scenes, he struggled with secrecy, personal recklessness, and a deep need to maintain the illusion of control. Affairs, hidden illnesses, and carefully curated media appearances all fed the legend, but blurred the man. His short presidency ended in tragedy before he could prove whether the myth could match the mission. Kennedy's story reminds us that image may win hearts, but substance sustains history. Leadership built on perception alone burns bright and fades fast.
Richard Nixon was one of the most brilliant and self-destructive presidents in American history, a master strategist, foreign policy genius, and political survivor. But his fatal weakness was paranoia, a belief that everyone was out to destroy him. That fear defined his presidency. Even after winning in a landslide, Nixon distrusted the media, his staff, and the political establishment. He built secret systems of surveillance, enemies lists, and cover-ups, convinced he was protecting his legacy. The breaking point came with Watergate, a botched burglary that spiraled into the nation's greatest political scandal. Instead of owning up, Nixon doubled down, lying to the public and obstructing justice. His fear of losing control led him to lose everything. In 1974, he became the first U.S. president to resign in disgrace. Yet, ironically, his paranoia destroyed the very trust he worked a lifetime to earn. Nixon's fall proved a timeless truth. When power becomes a shield against fear, it eventually becomes the weapon that ends you.
Bill Clinton had the rare gift of connection, a mind sharp enough for policy and a voice that made people believe. Under his leadership, America saw economic growth, a budget surplus, and global influence. But his greatest weakness was impulse, driven by ego and desire. Clinton's charisma, the same force that won hearts and elections, also blurred his judgment. His relationship with Monica Lewinsky, a White House intern, turned from a private mistake into a national scandal. What began as recklessness became a constitutional crisis. When the truth surfaced, his denial under oath led to impeachment, not for policy failure, but for personal failure. Yet, in a strange paradox, his approval ratings soared. Americans admired his intelligence, but couldn't ignore his flaws. The scandal stained an otherwise successful presidency, reminding the world that brilliance means little without restraint. Clinton's story stands as a warning. Charm can win the moment, but self-control decides the legacy.
Donald Trump, chaos as strategy. Donald Trump transformed American politics into a spectacle, bold, unpredictable, and unapologetic. His greatest strength was his command of attention. His greatest weakness was believing chaos itself was leadership. From the moment he entered office, Trump thrived on conflict. He dominated headlines, framed every battle as him versus the establishment, and used outrage as fuel. But that constant turbulence came at a cost. His White House saw record staff turnover, relentless media wars, and deep national polarization. To his supporters, he was a fighter who said what others wouldn't. To his critics, he dismantled norms that held democracy steady. The Capitol riot, the peak of his divisive rhetoric, revealed the danger of blurring power with provocation. Trump's presidency proved that disruption can win elections, but not necessarily unity. His story reminds us, shock may capture history's spotlight, but it rarely earns history's respect.